The Dag Farmhouse Disturbance. The winter of 1,889 inches, the Ottawa Valley was harsh and unforgiving, a season where the cold seemed to seep through the walls of even the sturdiest homes. In the small community of Clarendon, Quebec, specifically in the Shawville area, the farmhouse of George Dag stood isolated against a landscape of snow and timber. It was a modest structure, typical for a hardworking farmer trying to support a wife, two young children, and an adopted girl named Dinah. For years, the rhythm of life at the Dag farm was dictated entirely by the demands of agriculture and the weather. There was nothing to suggest that this specific plot of land would soon become the center of a chaotic and terrifying series of events that would draw witnesses from across the region and leave a permanent mark on local history. The trouble did not begin with a storm or a sudden accident, but with small domestic anomalies that were easy to dismiss at first. It started in September, a time when the harvest work usually occupied every waking thought of the household. The first sign that something was wrong was purely financial, or so it seemed. George Dag found a banknote he had left on a dresser torn into pieces. It was a frustrating discovery, one he initially blamed on a mischievous child or perhaps a rodent, though the tears looked deliberate. He pieced the money back together and tried to put it out of his mind. But the atmosphere in the house began to shift rapidly after that. The air felt heavier, and the family started noticing strange stains appearing on the floorboards. It looked like red paint or blood, appearing in spots where no one had been standing. George scrubbed the floors, confused but not yet afraid. He asked his wife Susan if she had spilled anything, but she was just as baffled as he was. The stains would be cleaned away only to reappear hours later in a different pattern. It was a nuisance, a bizarre housekeeping issue that defied explanation, but it was not yet threatening. As the weeks pushed toward November, the activity escalated from passive stains to active movement. The family would be sitting at dinner when a jug of milk would slide across the table on its own. It did not tip over immediately, but moved with a steady, deliberate friction against the wood before crashing to the floor. The sound of shattering pottery became a common backdrop to their evenings. Objects that had sat on shelves for years suddenly seemed to lose their grip on gravity. A jar of pickles flew from a cupboard and smashed against a wall while the family was in the next room. Susan Dag began to fear for the safety of the children, particularly the young boy, John, and the little girl, Mary. But the activity seemed strangely focused around the presence of the 11-year-old adopted girl, Dinah. Whenever she was in a room, the air seemed charged with a static tension that preceded the movement of objects. The community of Clarendon was tight-knit, and rumors began to spread that the Dag family was struggling with something they could not handle. George, a proud man who valued his reputation, was reluctant to ask for help. He tried to rationalize the events. He looked for loose floorboards that might cause furniture to wobble. He checked the foundation for settling that might explain the sliding objects. He looked for drafts that could knock things off shelves. But his rationalizations collapsed when the fire started. It was mid-November when the phenomenon took a dangerous turn. Smoke began to curl up from unexpected places inside the house. A window curtain burst into flames in an empty room. George rushed in to douse it with a bucket of water, his heart racing. Before he could catch his breath, he smelled smoke coming from the bedroom. A pillow on the bed was smoldering. These were not sparks from the fireplace. The fire started in the middle of fabrics, far from any heat source. Over the course of a single day, the family had to extinguish nearly 10 separate fires. They broke out in clothing, in bedding, and even in piles of paper. The terror was immediate and visceral. This was no longer a curiosity. The house itself seemed intent on consuming them. Exhausted and fearing they would burn to death in their sleep, George made the decision to evacuate the main house. He moved his family into a shed on the property, hoping that the distance would provide safety. They carried only the essentials, leaving the haunted farmhouse to stand dark and empty in the cold November night. But the reprieve was short-lived. The phenomena followed them. The shed offered no protection. As the family huddled together, stones began to rain down on the roof. It sounded like a hailstorm, but the sky was clear. Then the stones started coming inside. They did not seem to be thrown through the door or windows in a normal trajectory. Witnesses described the stones as appearing in midair or dropping straight down from the ceiling. They were smooth river stones, some small, some large enough to cause serious injury. George went outside, scanning the perimeter of the property, convinced that someone was playing a cruel prank. He expected to find a group of local boys hiding in the bushes or behind the barn. He found no one. The snow around the shed was undisturbed, yet the stones continued to batter the structure. Desperation drove George to seek help from the wider community. He realized that if he did not get outside verification, people would think he had lost his mind. He invited neighbors to come and see for themselves. At first, people were skeptical. They arrived expecting to find a family gripped by hysteria or a hoax orchestrated by the children. What they found silenced their doubts. Arthur Smart, a local skeptic, arrived at the farm determined to expose the trickery. He stood in the main room of the farmhouse, which the family had cautiously re-entered during the day. As he stood there, a stone the size of a hen's egg flew across the room and struck him. He could not determine the source. He watched as a wash basin rose from its stand and crashed to the floor. Smart left the farm shaken, his skepticism replaced by a deep unease. Word reached a man named Percy Woodcock, a well-known artist and an amateur investigator of the unexplained who was staying in Brockville. Woodcock was a man of education and intellect, not easily swayed by country superstitions. He heard the reports coming out of Clarendon and decided to travel to the Dag farm to document the events firsthand. He arrived with a notebook and a critical eye, prepared to dismantle a fraud. Instead, he became the primary chronicler of one of the most intense hauntings in Canadian history. Woodcock arrived in the aftermath of the fires, just as the phenomenon was shifting into a new, more disturbing phase. The physical assaults were continuing, but now the entity was beginning to communicate. Woodcock spent days at the farm observing the family dynamics. He noted that Dinah seemed to be the epicenter. She was a quiet girl, often looking exhausted and frightened. When she was present, the activity spiked. Woodcock witnessed stones floating through the air, moving with a trajectory that defied physics. He saw them turn corners and slow down before hitting a target. He noted that while the stones often hit people, they rarely caused significant pain, as if the force was dampened at the last second. It was terrifying, but controlled. But the most chilling aspect for Woodcock was the sound that began to emanate from the empty air. It started as a low, guttural growl, distinct from any animal native to the region. The growling evolved into a voice. It was a gruff, masculine voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It did not originate from Dinah's mouth. Witnesses, including Woodcock, observed her closely while the voice spoke. Her lips did not move, and the sound often came from a corner of the room or from the ceiling. The voice was abusive and vulgar. It shouted obscenities at the family, mocked their fear, and made specific threats. It seemed to know things about the neighbors that no one else knew, revealing secrets that caused embarrassment and shock among the witnesses. This marked a turning point in the haunting. It was no longer just a force, it was a personality. Woodcock decided to engage the voice directly. He treated it not as a ghost, but as an intelligence that could be reasoned with or at least analyzed. He asked the entity what it was. The voice responded with a barrage of profanity, calling itself the devil. It claimed it was there to torment the family until they were driven out. Woodcock remained calm, recording the dialogue in his notes. He challenged the entity, asking it to perform specific tasks to prove its power. On one occasion, he asked the entity to retrieve a piece of paper he had marked and placed in a different location. Moments later, the paper drifted down from the ceiling, landing at his feet. The interaction between the artist and the invisible presence became a bizarre battle of wills. The sheer number of witnesses grew daily. People traveled from Ottawa and surrounding townships, clogging the road to the Dag farm. They crowded into the house, hoping to see a chair move or hear the voice. The farmhouse became a theater of the impossible. One witness, a local magistrate, watched as a pane of glass in the window shattered inward, yet the shards of glass remained on the sill, not scattering onto the floor. Another witness reported seeing a heavy dining table lift entirely off the ground while 3 men tried to hold it down. The force required to lift it against their resistance was immense. Through it all, the Dag family tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but the strain was visible on their faces. George was losing weight, and Susan was perpetually on the verge of collapse. The voice began to show a strange duality. While it spent hours cursing and threatening, there were moments where it shifted tone completely. In one instance, while Woodcock was present, the voice began to sing. It did not sing a bawdy tavern song, but a hymn. The sound was high and clear, completely different from the gruff growl that usually terrorized the house. It sang "Nearer, My God, to Thee" with perfect pitch. The witnesses in the room were stunned into silence. The entity then engaged in a theological debate with Woodcock, discussing scripture and morality. This contradiction baffled the investigator. How could something that threw stones and started fires also sing hymns and discuss God? It added a layer of psychological complexity that made the case unique. Dinah, the young girl at the center, was often the target of the voice's duality. It would threaten to hurt her one moment, and then later it would claim to be her protector. Woodcock observed that the entity seemed possessive of the child. When Dinah was sent to a neighbor's house to sleep, hoping to give her some rest, the activity often ceased at the Dag farm, only to start up mildly at the neighbor's location. However, the most violent manifestations remained tied to the farmhouse itself. It was as if the energy required the combination of the location and the girl to reach its full potential. The psychological toll on Dinah was immense, yet she remained surprisingly resilient, often describing the presence as something she could feel before it acted. As December approached, the intensity of the haunting reached its peak. The fires had stopped, likely because the family had removed almost every flammable item they could spare, but the verbal harassment was constant. The entity began to claim that its time was short. It told Woodcock that it would be leaving soon. The reasons it gave were vague and conflicting. Sometimes it said it had completed its work, other times it claimed it was being forced out by a higher power. Woodcock pressed for a specific time and date. The voice gave a date in mid-November, but that passed with no change. Then it gave a date in early December. The unpredictability kept the family in a state of constant anxiety, never knowing if the quiet moments were the end or just a pause before a bigger storm. The physical phenomena became more aggressive toward visitors who mocked it. A man who laughed at the stories and dared the ghost to show itself was immediately struck in the face by a wet rag that materialized out of thin air. The rag was cold and smelled of swamp water. Another skeptic was hit by a stone that left a visible bruise on his arm. These targeted attacks served to validate the stories for the doubters. It was not just random energy, it was reactive. It listened. It understood context. It had a temper. The Dag farm had effectively become a place where the laws of nature were suspended, and the community had to accept that there was something happening in their midst that their religion and their science could not explain. One particular afternoon, the farmhouse was packed with 17 witnesses. They included neighbors, family members, and curious travelers. The activity was relentless. Stones were thumping against the walls, Voices were shouting from the corners, and objects were dancing on the tables. Woodcock realized the importance of this moment. He knew that once the haunting ended, people would claim it was mass hysteria or a tall tale. He decided to draft a legal document. It was a statement of facts, detailing exactly what they had seen and heard. He wrote down the descriptions of the fires, the stone throwing, and the voice. He read it aloud to the room, asking if everyone agreed that this was an accurate account of their experience. Every person in the room agreed. One by one, they signed the document. It was a remarkable moment in the history of paranormal investigation, a sworn affidavit signed by 17 credible witnesses attesting to the reality of the impossible. They were farmers, laborers, and respected community members, putting their names to a paper that declared they had seen chairs move and heard a disembodied voice. They knew they might be ridiculed, but the immediacy of the experience compelled them to sign. They wanted it on record that the Dagg family was not lying. They wanted it known that they had stood in that cold farmhouse and witnessed things that should not be. Shortly after the signing of the statement, the activity began to wane. The voice spoke less frequently, its tone losing the aggressive edge that had defined it for weeks. The stones stopped falling. The furniture remained in place. The transition was not sudden, but a slow fading, like a storm blowing itself out. The entity, which had once dominated every hour of the day, became a sporadic nuisance, then a memory. By the deep winter of 1890, the Dagg farmhouse was quiet. The family, traumatized and exhausted, tentatively began to move their lives back to normal. They repaired the broken windows and scrubbed the scorch marks from the floors. They brought the furniture back in, testing it to see if it would stay put. The departure of the entity left a vacuum of silence that was almost as unsettling as the noise. George Dagg never fully recovered his sense of security. He had seen his home turned into a battleground against an invisible enemy. Susan Dagg remained vigilant, watching the children for any sign that the presence had returned. Dinah, the focus of so much of the energy, grew up and eventually moved away, living a life that was largely quiet and unremarkable, a stark contrast to the chaos of her childhood. She rarely spoke of the events publicly in her later years, perhaps wishing to leave the darkness behind in Clarendon. Percy Woodcock left the farm with his notebook filled and his worldview shaken. He had come to expose a fraud and left as a believer in the unexplained. He championed the story not as a campfire tale, but as a documented case of spiritual interaction. He published his account detailing the conversations with the voice and the behavior of the thing. His report remains one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of a poltergeist outbreak from that era. He emphasized the intelligence of the entity, the way it played with them, and the distinct lack of fear it showed toward religious intervention. It was a puzzle he never solved, only observed. The Dagg haunting, or the Dagg poltergeist, as it came to be known in quieter circles, faded from national headlines but remained a potent legend in the Ottawa Valley. It was never solved. No trickwires were ever found, no ventriloquist was ever discovered. The sheer duration of the event, lasting several months, and the variety of phenomena from fire to sound to physical force made it difficult to dismiss as a simple prank. Pranks usually have a punchline or a profit motive. This had neither. It only brought destruction and terror to a poor farming family. The signed statement by the 17 witnesses sits in archives as a stubborn piece of evidence, a piece of paper that insists that for one winter in Quebec, the impossible became real. In the years that followed, the story was often retold in the region, passed down through generations of families who had been there or knew someone who had. The farmhouse eventually fell into disrepair, reclaimed by the harsh Canadian elements that had battered it during that long winter. But the core of the mystery remained. The entity had claimed to be a devil, then sang hymns. It had thrown stones to hurt, then claimed to protect the child. It was a mass of contradictions that mirrored the human mind, leading some to speculate on the psychic connection between Dinah and the energy. Was it an external spirit, or was it a manifestation of the stress and repressed energy of a young girl living in a hard environment? Is less than has hone. Zero hash is greater than. Modern researchers looking back at the DAG case point to the recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis theory, suggesting that Dinah was the unwitting agent of the chaos. The movement of objects, the fires, even the voice could be interpreted as a projection of adolescent turmoil. But this theory struggles to explain the shared auditory hallucinations, if that is what they were, or the physical bruises left on skeptics. The information provided by the voice regarding the secrets of the neighbors suggests an intelligence that had access to knowledge Dinah could not possibly have possessed. The mud incident, where sludge appeared from nowhere, and the spontaneous fires remain difficult to categorize under simple telekinesis. The legacy of the DAG haunting is one of unease. It sits uncomfortably in history, a verified event with no verified explanation. It is a story about the fragility of domestic safety, about how quickly a home can become a prison. The image of the family huddled in a shed while stones rain down from a clear sky is a potent reminder of their helplessness. They were besieged by an unseen force that operated by its own rules, a force that could not be shot, arrested, or reasoned with. The neutrality of the winter landscape, the white snow and the gray sky, provided a blank canvas for a terror that was vivid and loud. Today, the location of the farm is quiet. The intense energy that once boiled there has long since dissipated into the earth, but the records remain. The testimony of the local minister, the sketches by Woodcock, and the newspaper reports from the era form a mosaic of a haunting that was undeniably physical. It was not a ghost story of fleeting shadows and cold spots. It was a violent, noisy intrusion into reality. The DAG family survived it, but they did not conquer it. They simply endured until it chose to leave, and that lack of resolution is perhaps the most disturbing element of all. It implies that such things can happen, can tear a life apart, and then simply vanish, leaving the victims to sweep up the glass and wonder why. The incident serves as a historical bookmark in the study of Canadian folklore and paranormal research. It occurred in an era where superstition and nascent scientific inquiry often overlapped. The people involved were not seeking fame, they were seeking survival. The witnesses were not looking for ghosts, they were looking for answers. What they found was a void that looked back at them, a voice that knew their names, and a fire that started without a match. It remains a definitive, if often overlooked, example of the raw, chaotic nature of the poltergeist phenomenon, stripped of Gothic romance and left bare in the cold light of a Quebec winter. The sound of the gray forest. The interior of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state is defined by its density and a specific type of silence that carries a heavy weight. In the early 1990s, a small group of experienced forestry surveyors and environmental researchers began documenting a series of sensory anomalies in a remote drainage basin located several miles from any maintained trailheads. The area was characterized by old-growth cedar and hemlock trees that blocked out a significant portion of the daylight, creating a permanent twilight on the forest floor even during the height of summer. These professionals were accustomed to the isolation of the Pacific Northwest wilderness, but the reports coming out of this specific sector began to deviate from the standard challenges of fieldwork. It started with the persistent feeling of being watched from the tree line, a common psychological reaction to deep woods environments, but it quickly evolved into something more structurally organized and difficult to dismiss as mere isolation-induced anxiety. One surveyor, who had spent over a decade mapping remote sections of the Cascades and the Olympics, noted in his logs that the wildlife in the drainage basin seemed to disappear entirely once the sun dipped below the surrounding ridges. Usually, a forest of that size and health would be loud with the sounds of nocturnal insects, owls, and small mammals. Instead, the team described a vacuum of sound that felt unnatural. When they spoke to one another, their voices did not seem to carry. The sound would drop off just a few feet away from the speaker, as if the air itself was too thick to transmit vibrations. This acoustic dead zone became the primary focus of their private discussions at camp, as it interfered with their ability to coordinate their movements across the rugged terrain. They began to refer to the phenomenon as the gray blanket, describing how the fog and the silence seemed to work together to isolate each individual even when they were within sight of their colleagues. By the third week of the expedition, the reported experiences shifted from passive environmental oddities to active sensory disturbances. Multiple members of the team began reporting the sound of heavy, rhythmic breathing that seemed to originate from directly behind them. Whenever they turned to identify the source, there was nothing but the swaying branches of the hemlocks. This was not the quick, frantic breathing of a startled animal, but a slow, methodical respiration that matched the pace of a large lung capacity. One researcher recorded in his field notes that he stopped walking to tie his boot and heard the breathing stop exactly 2 seconds after he did. When he resumed his pace, the sound resumed. He tested this several times, finding that the auditory mimicry was nearly perfect, but always slightly delayed, suggesting a conscious attempt to mirror his movements rather than a natural echo or an environmental fluke. The psychological strain on the crew became evident as the days progressed. They were not dealing with a threat they could see or a predator they could track. There were no tracks left in the soft moss, no broken branches, and no hair caught on the bark of the trees. The terrain remained undisturbed, yet the sensation of a physical presence was so overwhelming that several team members refused to leave the immediate perimeter of the base camp alone. They began to experience a shared perception of a tall, thin silhouette that would stand at the edge of their lantern light at night. This figure never moved or made a sound. It was described as being slightly darker than the surrounding night, a void in the shape of a human that lacked any discernible features. When they shone their high-powered flashlights toward the spot where they saw the shape, the beams would cut through the mist and reveal nothing but empty space between the trees. As the team moved deeper into the basin to complete their surveys, the time distortion began. This is a phenomenon often reported in high-strung survival situations, but the consistency among the different team members was what made this case stand out in local regional records. On one particular Tuesday, 2 surveyors left camp at 7 in the morning to mark a boundary line less than half a mile away. They estimated the task would take 2 hours at most. According to their watches and their internal sense of time, they performed the work and returned to camp in what felt like the expected duration. However, when they arrived back at the base, they found their colleagues in a state of panic. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon. The 2 men had been gone for 9 hours, but they had no memory of the missing 7 hours. They had not eaten their packed lunches, and they did not feel particularly hungry or tired, yet the sun was already beginning to set behind the western peaks. The lack of physical evidence was perhaps the most disturbing aspect for the researchers. They were trained to look at the world through a lens of data and tangible proof. They set up motion-activated cameras around the camp to catch whatever was stalking them. When they checked the film later, the cameras had been triggered dozens of times throughout the night. Every single frame was blank, showing only the empty forest floor or the trunks of the trees. There was no technical malfunction found with the equipment. It appeared as though something was triggering the sensors, but remained invisible to the camera lens. This led to a theory among the crew that the phenomenon was not a biological entity at all. but some kind of localized electromagnetic or atmospheric anomaly that was playing tricks on their nervous systems and their electronic gear. One evening, the entire group experienced a collective auditory event that ended their desire to remain in the basin. They were sitting around a small stove, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, when a sound like a heavy metallic lid being slammed shut echoed through the valley. It was followed by a series of vocalizations that sounded like human speech played backward and at half speed. The sounds did not come from a single direction. They seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet. The team described the feeling as a low-frequency hum that made their teeth ache and caused a deep sense of dread in their chests. It lasted for approximately 3 minutes before cutting off abruptly, leaving them in that same heavy, suffocating silence they had grown to fear. There was no wind that night, and there were no industrial operations or low-flying aircraft within 50 miles of their location. The following morning, the decision was made to break camp and head back to the trailhead early. The retreat was marked by a sense of urgency that bordered on panic. As they packed their gear, they found that several items had been moved. Their heavy sample bags, which had been neatly stacked the night before, were now scattered in a wide circle around the campsite. Nothing was missing and nothing was damaged, but the bags had been relocated with a precision that seemed intentional. The heaviest bags weighed over 60 pounds, and moving them would have required significant effort, yet no one had heard a sound during the night. The moss on the ground where the bags had been dragged showed no signs of disturbance, as if they had been lifted and placed down rather than pulled across the surface. During the hike out, the lead surveyor reported seeing a man standing in a thicket of ferns about 50 yards off the trail. The man was dressed in clothing that appeared to be from the 1920s, consisting of a heavy wool coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He was standing perfectly still, looking away from the trail. The surveyor called out to him, thinking it might be a lost hiker or a local resident, but the man did not respond. When the surveyor stepped off the trail to get a closer look, the figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows of the trees. It didn't run or hide, it simply ceased to be visible as the light shifted. The rest of the team, who were only a few paces behind, saw nothing but the ferns. This incident further cemented the idea that the environment itself was projecting images or memories that had no place in the present moment. When the group finally reached the trailhead and returned to their office in the city, they found it difficult to translate their experiences into an official report. How does a professional researcher explain that they were intimidated by a silence that felt like a physical weight, or that they lost 7 hours of their lives while walking a few hundred yards? The official documentation of the survey noted the geographic data and the soil samples they managed to collect, but the personal journals of the men involved told a much different story. They spoke of a place where the laws of physics and the boundaries of human perception seemed to blur. They spoke of a forest that felt less like a collection of trees and more like a single, massive consciousness that was aware of their presence and was slowly trying to incorporate them into its own distorted sense of time. In the years following the expedition, several members of the team returned to the Olympic Peninsula, but none of them would go back to that specific drainage basin. Local records from the area reveal a history of similar reports dating back to the late 19th century. Loggers in the 1890s wrote about the whistling trees that would sound like human voices calling out names in the dark. Native American oral traditions also warned of certain valleys in the interior that were avoided because they were considered places where the veil between the world of the living and the world of the unseen was dangerously thin. These stories were often dismissed as folklore or the results of cabin fever, but for the men who experienced the events in the 1990s, the fear was grounded in a very modern, very tangible reality. One of the most lingering effects of the encounter was the change in the team's perception of sound. Several members reported that for months after leaving the forest, they had difficulty sleeping in complete silence. They had grown so accustomed to the oppressive, artificial quiet of the basin that the normal sounds of a suburban neighborhood, the hum of a refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic felt abrasive and loud. Conversely, if they found themselves in a truly quiet room, they would start to hear that same rhythmic breathing they had heard in the woods. It was as if a part of their auditory processing had been permanently recalibrated by the environment they had stepped into. They were no longer able to trust their own ears, constantly questioning whether a sound was real or a lingering echo of the Olympic interior. The mystery of the missing time was never solved. No evidence of drug exposure, carbon monoxide poisoning, or shared delusional episodes could be found. The men were in peak physical and mental health prior to the trip. The equipment they used was calibrated and functioning correctly. The only common denominator was the location itself. Geologists have since looked into the area, noting that the specific mineral composition of the rock in that basin might create unusual magnetic variances, but nothing that would account for the level of sensory distortion reported by the witnesses. The magnetic theory also fails to explain the visual sightings or the organized movement of the heavy equipment. As the story of the survey team faded into local legend, it joined a long list of unexplained occurrences in the deep woods of the American Northwest. These are stories that don't involve monsters in the traditional sense, but rather a fundamental breakdown of what we consider to be reality. The forest remains there, a sprawling, indifferent expanse of green and gray. The drainage basin is still remote, rarely visited by anyone today. The trees continue to grow in the permanent twilight, and the silence remains as heavy as it was 30 years ago. For those who know where to look in the archives, the reports of the breathing woods and the missing hours serve as a quiet reminder that there are still pockets of the world where the human experience is not the dominant one. The psychological impact of the incident led one of the researchers to pursue a secondary career in acoustic ecology, trying to understand how soundscapes can influence human behavior and perception. He never found a perfect match for what he heard in the Olympics, but he did discover that certain low-frequency vibrations can induce feelings of paranoia and the sensation of being watched. However, he admitted that this scientific explanation didn't quite cover the visual elements or the synchronized loss of time. He remained convinced that while science could explain the symptoms, it couldn't explain the source. To him, the basin was a place where the environment was actively trying to communicate something, even if the human brain wasn't equipped to translate the message. The events are often cited in specialized circles as a classic example of an environmental haunting. Unlike a traditional haunting centered on a house or a grave, an environmental haunting is tied to the land itself. It is a recurring pattern of energy or perception that is triggered by specific conditions in the natural world. In this case, the combination of the dense canopy, the unique geography of the basin, and perhaps the specific weather patterns of the Olympic Peninsula created a perfect storm for a reality-bending experience. It suggests that our understanding of the wilderness is still very much on the surface, and that beneath the beauty of the national parks lies a layer of the world that is completely alien to us. The narrative of the Gray Forest serves as a cautionary tale for those who venture too far off the beaten path without respecting the power of the landscape. It isn't about the fear of a predator or the fear of getting lost. It is the fear of losing one's grip on the fundamental truths of existence. The men who walked into that basin were professionals who believed in maps, watches, and the reliability of their own senses. They walked out as men who understood that maps can be wrong, watches can skip hours, and senses can be manipulated by the very air they breathe. The unresolved tension of their story lies in that realization. The forest didn't attack them, it simply showed them that they didn't belong there, and that their presence was being tolerated by something much larger and much older than they could imagine. In the end, the records of the expedition were archived in a regional forestry library where they remain to this day. They are tucked between reports on soil acidity and timber yields, a strange and unsettling anomaly in a sea of dry data. Occasionally, a new researcher or a curious hiker will stumble upon the files and read about the breathing sounds and the missing hours. They might laugh it off as a joke or a product of the isolation, but if they ever find themselves in the deep interior of the Olympic Peninsula as the sun begins to set, they might find their thoughts returning to those old reports. They might find themselves listening a little more closely to the silence, and they might find themselves checking their watches a little more often, wondering if the time they are seeing is the same time the rest of the world is experiencing. The persistence of the gray blanket phenomenon suggests that these incidents are not isolated to a single decade or a single group of people. Rather, they are a part of the long-term history of the region. Every few years, a story emerges from the Olympics that mirrors the experiences of the 1990s team. A hiker reports hearing their own name called out by a voice that sounds exactly like their mother's. A camping group finds their tent moved 20 feet in the middle of the night without waking them. A photographer discovers a silhouette in the background of a shot that wasn't there when they pressed the shutter. These are the modern echoes of an ancient mystery, a set of experiences that defy classification and remain stubbornly outside the reach of conventional investigation. What makes this particular case so compelling is the lack of a definitive ending. There was no grand reveal, no confrontation, and no resolution. The team simply left, and the forest remained. This lack of closure is what keeps the story alive in the minds of those who study it. It forces us to confront the idea that some things in this world are not meant to be understood, they are simply meant to be witnessed. The gray forest is a place of witness, a location where the natural world performs a slow, silent drama that we can only catch glimpses of. It reminds us that for all our technology and our desire to map every inch of the planet, there are still places that remain dark, quiet, and fundamentally unknown. The surveyor who first noted the breathing sounds eventually retired to a small town on the coast, away from the heavy timber and the deep valleys. He spent his final years looking out at the ocean, an environment that he found much more honest than the forest. The ocean was dangerous, yes, but its dangers were visible and its sounds were consistent. It didn't mimic you, and it didn't steal your time. He rarely spoke about the 1990s expedition, but when he did, he always mentioned the same thing. He didn't care about what the thing in the woods was. He only cared that he had gotten out before the forest decided he was a part of it. His story, like the stories of the others, remains a testament to the unsettling power of the American wilderness and the thin line between reality and the unexplained. The geography of the Olympic Peninsula continues to shift as the years go by. New growth covers old trails, and landslides alter the shape of the valleys. The drainage basin where the events took place may look different today, but the core of the environment remains the same. It is a place of extreme moisture, extreme density, and extreme isolation. Those who study the area from a distance suggest that the specific combination of environmental factors there might never be fully replicated elsewhere, making it a unique laboratory for the strange. But for those who have been there, it is not a laboratory. It is a place where the air feels like a physical presence and where the silence has a heartbeat of its own. One detail that often gets overlooked in the archival reports is the state of the team's equipment months later. Several of the electronic devices that were used during the survey, handheld radios and GPS units, began to fail in strange ways. The radios would occasionally pick up low-frequency signals that sounded like heavy breathing even when they were turned off and the batteries were removed. The GPS units would sometimes display coordinates that didn't correspond to any location on Earth, showing the devices to be thousands of miles away or in the middle of the ocean. These technical glitches were dismissed as hardware degradation due to the moisture of the rainforest, but for the team members, it was a lingering reminder of the distorted reality they had inhabited. It was as if the equipment had been infected by the basin's logic, unable to function correctly in the normal world ever again. The legacy of the incident is found in the quiet conversations between park rangers and longtime residents of the peninsula. They know which areas to avoid during certain times of the year. They know that when the fog rolls in a certain way and the wind dies down completely, it's time to head back to the lowlands. They don't call it paranormal, and they don't call it a haunting. They just call it the way the woods are. This acceptance of the unexplained is a hallmark of the region, a recognition that the natural world has its own rules and its own moods. The story of the 1990s survey team is just one chapter in a much larger book of the Olympic interior, a book that is still being written by anyone brave or foolish enough to wander into the silence of the gray forest. As we look back on the timeline of these events, the escalation is clear. It began with a feeling, moved to a sound, transitioned into a distortion of time, and ended with a physical manipulation of the environment. This progression suggests a process of acclimatization, as if the environment was slowly tuning itself to the frequency of the human observers. If the team had stayed another week, it is impossible to know what the next stage would have been. Would the visual sightings have become more solid? Would the missing time have stretched into days or weeks? The decision to leave was not just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of self-preservation. They left because they realized they were losing the ability to distinguish between what was happening around them and what was happening within them. The final report from the lead researcher concluded with a surprisingly candid remark for a government document. He wrote that while the mission was a success in terms of data collection, he recommended that the specific sector be designated as a restricted area for future research. He didn't provide a scientific justification for this, but simply stated that the psychological toll on personnel was too high to justify further exploration. The recommendation was never officially adopted, but the sector remains largely ignored by the Forestry Service to this day. It is a place that has been effectively erased from the map by a consensus of silence. The mystery of the gray forest stands as a prominent example of how the real world can sometimes produce experiences that are more frightening than any fictional story. There are no jump scares here, no gore, and no clear villain. There is only the slow realization that the world we think we know is actually a very thin veneer over something much more complex and much more indifferent to our existence. The men of the survey team were not victims of a crime, but they were victims of a profound loss of certainty. They learned that the forest is not just a place we visit, it is a place that can visit us, changing our perception of time, sound, and reality itself. And once that change has happened, there is no going back to the way things were before. Today, the Olympic Peninsula remains a destination for millions of tourists who come to see its rugged beauty. They hike the trails, take photos of the moss-covered trees, and marvel at the scale of the landscape. Most of them never experience anything out of the ordinary. They stay on the path, they keep an eye on the time, and they return to their cars before dark. But for a few, the forest reveals its other side. They might notice the silence getting a bit too heavy, or they might hear a sound that doesn't belong. For them, the story of the 1990s survey team isn't just a piece of local history, it is a warning. It is a reminder that in the heart of the woods, there is a gray forest that is always watching, always breathing, and always waiting for someone to lose their way in its silent, timeless embrace. The details of the breathing and the silhouettes have been mirrored in other accounts across the border in Canada and further south in the Oregon wilderness, suggesting a broader phenomenon that spans the entire Pacific Northwest. Some researchers have suggested a link to infrasound produced by the interaction of wind and specific geological formations, which can cause hallucinations and physical discomfort. Others point to the possibility of unknown chemical compounds released by certain types of fungi in the deep woods. While these theories provide a comforting layer of scientific possibility, they fail to account for the shared nature of the experiences. When five different people see the same shadow and hear the same sound at the same time, the explanation must account for more than just an individual's brain chemistry. In the end, the story is left to the archives and the memories of the few who were there. It remains a definitive case of a real-world paranormal encounter that was documented by credible witnesses and never solved. It challenges our understanding of the environment and our place within it. The Olympic Peninsula is a vast and beautiful place, but it is also a place of deep shadows and unexplained silences. The next time you find yourself in the deep woods and the wind dies down and the birds stop singing, take a moment to listen. You might just hear the rhythmic breathing of the forest itself, reminding you that you are just a guest in a world that doesn't always play by your rules. The survey team members eventually moved on with their lives, but they were forever marked by those 3 weeks in the basin. One became a recluse, another changed careers entirely to work in urban planning, and the rest simply stopped going into the woods for recreation. The bond they formed was one of shared trauma and mutual understanding, a silent agreement never to fully explain what they felt during those missing hours. They knew that words would only diminish the reality of the experience. They had touched something that wasn't meant to be touched, and they had seen a side of the world that most people are lucky enough to never encounter. Their legacy is a reminder that the greatest horrors are often those that cannot be seen, but only felt in the weight of the air and the stillness of the trees. The story of the Gray Forest is not a ghost story in the traditional sense, but it is a story about the haunting power of the natural world. It is about the way a landscape can hold on to memories, or the way it can project a reality that is completely separate from our own. It is about the fragility of the human mind when faced with something it cannot categorize. As long as there are remote places on this earth, there will be stories like this. Stories of people who went into the wild and came back, changed not by what they saw, but by what they couldn't see. The Olympic interior remains a testament to that enduring mystery, a place where the gray blanket still falls and where the silence is never truly empty. The unseen presence at Point Lookout. The coastline along the northern tip of Stradbroke Island remains a place where the landscape often dictates the mood of those who traverse it. In the early 1950s, the area around Point Lookout was far more isolated than it is today, consisting mostly of rugged cliffs, dense scrub, and a few scattered dwellings that braved the salt spray and the isolation. Local families and visiting fishermen often spoke of the peculiar atmosphere that settled over the headlands when the sea mist rolled in, obscuring the horizon and muffling the sound of the crashing waves. It was during this period that a series of documented reports began to emerge regarding a specific stretch of the coastal path, where multiple individuals claimed to have encountered a presence that defied standard explanation. These witnesses were not looking for ghost stories. They were workers, locals, and travelers who found themselves caught in moments of profound, inexplicable dread. The first significant account involved a local surveyor named Thomas who was tasked with mapping the terrain near the North Gorge. It was a clear afternoon with high visibility, yet as Thomas worked near the edge of the cliffs, he reported a sudden and localized drop in temperature that felt entirely out of step with the subtropical climate. He described a sensation of being watched from the thickets of banksia trees that lined the ridge. When he turned to look, he saw nothing but the swaying branches, but the feeling of a heavy, breathing presence just behind his shoulder became so overwhelming that he was forced to stop his work. He later told acquaintances that it wasn't just a feeling of being observed, but a physical weight in the air that made it difficult to move his limbs with their usual coordination. He left his equipment and returned to the main settlement, refusing to go back to that specific coordinate until the following morning. As the weeks progressed, other reports began to filter through the small community. A group of fishermen who had set up camp near the same area reported a night of broken sleep and mounting anxiety. They claimed that while the fire was burning bright, the shadows cast against the rocks didn't seem to move in sync with the flames. One man specifically noted that a shadow appeared to detach itself from the rock face and stand motionless at the edge of their campsite. There was no sound of footsteps on the dry leaves and no rustle of clothing, yet every man in the group felt an instinctive urge to remain silent and still. They didn't speak to each other until the sun rose, at which point they discovered that none of them had actually seen a physical person, yet all of them had perceived the exact same dark shape standing in the same spot for nearly 4 hours. The phenomenon wasn't limited to nighttime encounters. A woman named Elizabeth, who lived in one of the few permanent cottages on the island, reported an incident during a midday walk along the cliffs. She was familiar with the local wildlife and the sounds of the bush, but on this particular day, she noted that all bird calls and insect noises suddenly ceased. The silence was so absolute it felt unnatural. As she continued along the path, she saw a figure dressed in dark, heavy clothing standing near the cliff edge. Thinking it was a hiker in distress, she called out to offer assistance. The figure did not turn or acknowledge her. As she approached within 20 feet, the figure seemed to blur at the edges, losing its definition against the blue of the ocean behind it. Elizabeth stopped in her tracks when she realized that she could see the horizon line directly through the torso of the individual. Within seconds, the shape dissipated like smoke, and the sound of the wind and birds returned instantly, as if a vacuum had been lifted. These incidents began to create a sense of unease among the residents of Point Lookout, leading some to look into the history of the land. There were no records of recent disappearances or violent crimes in that specific area that could provide a logical basis for a haunting. Instead, the report suggested a recurring environmental glitch or a residual presence that had no interest in communicating with the living. The witnesses often described a sense of profound sadness or ancient indifference emanating from the phenomenon. It wasn't an aggressive haunting in the traditional sense, but rather a series of intrusions by something that didn't belong to the current timeline. Some suggested that the unique geological composition of the island, with its massive sand dunes and underground freshwater aquifers, might be responsible for some kind of natural recording of past events, though this was purely speculative. By the mid-1950s, the frequency of these reports increased. A delivery driver who frequently moved supplies to the lighthouse keepers reported a strange distortion of time while driving the coastal track. He claimed he left the settlement at his usual time, a trip that normally took 20 minutes. He remembered seeing a tall, dark figure standing in the middle of the road near the North Gorge. He braked hard, expecting a collision, but the figure was gone before his truck came to a complete stop. When he checked his watch, upon arriving at the lighthouse, nearly 2 hours had passed that he could not account for. He had no memory of anything other than the figure in the road and the sudden realization that the sun was much lower in the sky than it should have been. His fuel gauge also showed significantly less petrol than it should have for such a short journey, suggesting the vehicle had been idling or driving for a much longer duration. The local authorities were eventually notified of these recurring complaints, though there was little they could do. Without a crime or a missing person, the reports were filed away as curiosities or the result of heat exhaustion and isolation. However, the consistency of the descriptions provided by unrelated witnesses was difficult to ignore. Almost everyone mentioned the same dark, heavy clothing, the same blurring of edges, and the same paralyzing sense of dread that preceded the sighting. One constable who took a statement from a distraught camper noted that the witness seemed genuinely traumatized, not by what the figure did, but by the sheer wrongness of its presence. The camper had described the figure as having no face, just a smooth, dark surface where features should be, which seemed to absorb the light around it. In 1957, a visiting researcher from the mainland who was interested in coastal erosion spent several nights camping near the site of the most frequent sightings. He kept a meticulous log of weather conditions, tide levels, and any unusual occurrences. On his third night, his notes became increasingly erratic. He wrote about a rhythmic thumping sound that seemed to come from beneath the ground, followed by the sensation of the air becoming thick and difficult to breathe. He described seeing a series of lights moving across the water that did not correspond to any known shipping lanes or aircraft. Most tellingly, he recorded an experience where he felt his own perception of his surroundings begin to fracture. He wrote that the cliffs looked like they were made of glass, and he could see figures moving deep within the stone. He left the island the next day, leaving his research unfinished and refusing to discuss his notes in detail with anyone. The phenomenon at Point Lookout never reached a definitive conclusion or a dramatic climax. Instead, as the island became more developed and the population grew, the sightings began to taper off. The construction of newer roads and the clearing of some of the denser scrub may have altered the environment in a way that disrupted whatever conditions allowed these experiences to occur. By the 1970s, the stories had largely transitioned into local folklore, told to tourists around campfires, but rarely experienced with the same intensity as they were in the 1950s. The dense, oppressive atmosphere that once defined the North Gorge seemed to lift, or perhaps the modern world simply became too loud for the subtle distortions to be noticed. There are still those who walk the coastal paths today and claim to feel a sudden, inexplicable chill or a sense of being followed when no one else is around. Some photographers have reported strange artifacts in their digital images, dark blurs or shadows that don't align with the light sources, but these are easily dismissed as lens flares or technical errors. The original witnesses, many of whom have since passed away, remained steadfast in their accounts until the end. They didn't look for fame or money, they were simply people who encountered something that sat outside the boundaries of their everyday lives. They spoke of a Point Lookout that was older and more mysterious than the tourist destination it eventually became, a place where the veil between the known and the unknown was thin enough to let something through. One of the last well-documented accounts from the original era came from a retired schoolteacher who had lived on the island for 30 years. She described an evening in the late 1960s when she was sitting on her porch overlooking the sea. She watched as a dark figure walked out from the trees and proceeded to walk straight off the edge of the cliff. She ran to the edge, expecting to see a body on the rocks below, but the beach was empty and there was no sign of any disturbance in the water. There were no footprints in the sand, despite the tide being out. She noted that the most disturbing part wasn't the fall, but the way the figure moved. It didn't have the gait of a human, but rather moved with a mechanical, sliding motion that suggested it wasn't interacting with the gravity of the earth in a normal way. The mystery of the Point Lookout presence remains one of the most compelling examples of a localized, non-criminal paranormal event. It lacks the hallmarks of a staged hoax, as the witnesses were diverse and had nothing to gain from their stories. The lack of a clear backstory or a specific ghost with a name and a grievance makes it even more unsettling. It suggests that there are places in the world where the environment itself holds on to something we don't understand, or where time doesn't always flow in a straight line. The incidents were never linked to any cult activity, pranksters, or natural gas leaks that could cause hallucinations. They were simply moments of high-tension reality that left those involved forever changed in their perception of the world. The archival records of these events serve as a reminder that the world is often stranger than we give it credit for. While we look for logical explanations for every shadow and every chill, some things remain stubbornly outside the reach of science and reason. The people who stood on those cliffs in the 1950s and saw the faceless figures or felt the missing hours didn't care about theories. They only knew that they had touched something that felt fundamentally alien to the human experience. The landscape of Stradbroke Island continues to shift with the wind and the waves, but the memory of those encounters stays locked in the old reports and the stories told by those who remember the silence of the North Gorge. Even in the present day, researchers of the unexplained occasionally visit the island, hoping to catch a glimpse of what the early residents described. They bring sensors and cameras, looking for electromagnetic fluctuations or temperature spikes. While they sometimes find minor anomalies, nothing has ever matched the sheer scale and frequency of the mid-century sightings. It is as if the phenomenon had a lifespan of its own, or perhaps it only manifests when the conditions of human isolation and natural wildness are perfectly balanced. The modern amenities of the island may have acted as a form of grounding, pushing the unexplained back into the deeper, unreachable parts of the scrub. If you talk to the older generations who still reside in the area, they might point to a specific bend in the path or a particular rock formation where the air still feels a little too heavy. They won't tell you it is haunted by a person, but they might tell you that the land there has a memory that hasn't quite faded. They describe it as a ripple in water that takes a long time to settle. The feeling of being watched, the sudden silence of the birds, and the distortion of the light remain the primary indicators of this lingering residue. It is a haunting of place, not of person, where the horror comes from the realization that we are not always the primary inhabitants of the spaces we occupy. The legacy of these events is a quiet one. There are no plaques or markers indicating where the most famous sightings occurred. The island is content to let its secrets be buried under layers of sand and time. Yet, for those who have read the old testimonies or heard the first-hand accounts, the cliffs of Point Lookout will always carry a different weight. They represent a window into a period where the unexplained was a part of daily life for a few unfortunate witnesses, a time when the darkness at the edge of the campsite was something to be respected and feared. The faceless figure of the 1950s remains one of Australia's most enduring and least understood mysteries, a silent sentinel in the history of the island's rugged coast. As the sun sets over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the North Gorge, it is easy to see how the mind might play tricks. But for Thomas the surveyor, Elizabeth the resident, and the unnamed campers of the 1950s, it wasn't a trick. It was a physical, palpable reality that challenged their understanding of the natural world. They lived through a series of events that lacked a climax or a resolution, which in many ways is more disturbing than a story with an ending. The unresolved nature of the Point Lookout incidents ensures that the phenomenon remains a subject of quiet fascination, a reminder that some things in this world are meant to remain unexplained, existing in the periphery of our vision and the gaps in our records. The sheer volume of consistent data from that era suggests that whatever was happening at Point Lookout was a sustained event. It wasn't a one-off sighting or a localized legend. It was a decade of high-frequency anomalies that centered on a very specific geographical coordinate. Whether it was a rift in time, a sensory echo of a past event, or something entirely outside our current classification of the paranormal, its impact on the local culture was profound. It shaped the way people interacted with the landscape, instilling a sense of caution that persists in the way locals talk about the cliffs after dark. They don't talk about ghosts, they talk about the atmosphere, the weight, and the silence. Ultimately, the story of Point Lookout is a story about the limits of human perception. We are built to recognize patterns and find causes, but the witnesses on Stradbroke Island found neither. They were left with nothing but the memory of a shadow that didn't move right and a silence that felt like a scream. The events remain a significant part of the region's hidden history, a collection of moments where the ordinary world was interrupted by something vast and indifferent. The fact that it stopped, or at least faded from view, provides little comfort to those who know the details of the reports. It only leaves the question of when the conditions might become right for the presence to return to the cliffs once more. Today, the North Gorge is a popular spot for whale watching and scenic walks. Thousands of people pass through the area every year, most of them completely unaware of the history of the ground they walk on. They take photos of the same cliffs where Elizabeth saw a man turn to smoke and where Thomas felt a hand on his shoulder in the empty bush. The beauty of the location masks its eerie past, providing a veneer of safety and normalcy. But for the researcher who digs through the old archives, or the local who listens to the stories of their grandparents, the beauty of Point Lookout is always tempered by the knowledge of what might be standing just out of sight, waiting for the mist to roll in and the birds to go silent. The persistence of the Point Lookout reports, even in their diminished modern form, highlights the human need to document the strange. Even when there is no logical framework to support what is being seen, the act of reporting it becomes a way to process the trauma of the unexplained. The 1950s accounts were recorded with a clinical, matter-of-fact tone that makes them even more chilling. These weren't people prone to flights of fancy. They were practical, hard-working individuals who were confronted with something that simply should not have been there. Their testimonies stand as a collective witness to a decade of strangeness that defined a generation's relationship with the island. In the end, we are left with a series of questions that may never be answered. Was there a specific event in the distant past that triggered these manifestations? Is there something about the magnetic field of the island that creates sensory distortions? Or is it possible that certain places on Earth act as crossroads for things we cannot see? The Point Lookout presence remains an enigma, a shadow on the history of the Australian coast that refuses to be fully explained or forgotten. It serves as a stark reminder that even in a world mapped and explored, there are still pockets of the unknown that wait for a solitary walker to turn a corner and find themselves in a silence that shouldn't exist. The narrative of this coastal mystery is built on the quietest details, the sound of a footfall that isn't there, the sight of a horizon through a human shape, and the feeling of hours slipping away like water. These are the elements that stayed with the witnesses for the rest of their lives. They didn't tell stories of monsters, they told stories of a world that briefly stopped making sense. And as the waves continue to batter the rocks at the North Gorge, the island holds on to those moments, keeping them safe in the salt air and the shifting sands, a permanent part of the landscape that most will never see, but some will never forget. The final records from the late 1950s show a community that had grown weary of the strangeness. The reports became shorter, less detailed, as if the people had accepted the presence as just another hazard of the island, like the riptides or the summer storms. This normalization of the paranormal is perhaps the most interesting aspect of the case. It suggests that humans can adapt to almost anything, even the presence of a faceless figure standing on a cliff edge. The mystery didn't go away because it was solved. It went away because the world moved on, leaving the shadows of Point Lookout to find their own peace in the isolation of the coast. As we look back at the documented history of this period, the consistency across the decades remains the most striking feature. From the first surveyor in the early 50s to the retired teacher in the late 60s, the descriptions of the figure and the environmental changes remained virtually identical. This suggests a stable phenomenon rather than a series of disconnected hallucinations. It was a singular, recurring event that focused its energy on a specific patch of Earth. While we may never know what it was, the records provide a clear and unsettling picture of what it felt like to encounter it. Point Lookout remains a place of great natural beauty. But for those who know its history, that beauty will always be shadowed by the memory of the presence that once claimed the cliffs as its own. The story concludes not with a revelation, but with the same ambiguity that defined the events themselves. The presence at Point Lookout didn't leave a message or a warning. It didn't change the course of history or reveal great truths. It simply existed, a brief and terrifying intersection between the known and the unknown. Its legacy is found in the hushed tones of local stories and the yellowing pages of old reports, a reminder that the most disturbing things are often the ones that have no explanation and no purpose, existing simply because the world is far more complex than we can imagine. The island's topography, dominated by its massive sand dunes and the vastness of the Pacific, provides the perfect backdrop for such a lingering mystery. The sand itself is a shifting, ancient medium capable of burying secrets for centuries. Some believe that the very ground at Point Lookout acts as a vessel for these echoes, and that the events of the 1950s were simply a period where the vessel overflowed. Whether that is true or not, the impact on those who experienced it was very real. They walked away from those cliffs with a new understanding of the dark, a sense that the shadows aren't always empty and that the silence of the bush isn't always peaceful. As the modern era continues to encroach upon the wild spaces of Australia, cases like the Point Lookout presence become even more significant. They represent the last vestiges of a time when the land was still capable of surprising us, of presenting us with something that we couldn't categorize or control. The faceless figure in the dark clothing remains a symbol of that era, a silent, blurring shape on the edge of the world, reminding us to be careful when we call out into the mist, because we might not like what doesn't answer back. The archival search for similar incidents along the coast has yielded few results that match the intensity of Point Lookout. Other islands have their legends, and other headlands have their ghost stories, but none possess the same clinical documentation of a recurring, non-criminal environmental disturbance. This uniqueness makes the case a cornerstone of Australian paranormal research, even if it remains out of the mainstream spotlight. It is a local mystery that has stayed local, preserved by the people who live there and the archives that keep their secrets. In closing, the events at Point Lookout during the 1950s stand as a testament to the power of place. The cliffs, the gorge, and the sea created a stage for something that defied the laws of the everyday. The witnesses were the unwilling audience, left to interpret a performance that had no script and no end. Their stories remain as a shadow on the landscape, a chilling reminder that some parts of the world are still governed by rules we haven't learned yet, and that the most frightening things are often the ones that stand perfectly still and say nothing at all. The final analysis of the witness accounts suggests that the dread was the most consistent symptom of the encounter. It was a biological response to an external stimulus that the human brain couldn't process. When the fishermen saw the shadow detach from the rock, or when Elizabeth saw the horizon through a man's chest, their bodies responded with a primal fear that bypassed logic. This fear is what links all the stories together, creating a narrative of a decade-long haunting that left a permanent mark on the psyche of a small island community. The presence may be gone, or it may simply be waiting for the world to become quiet enough for it to be seen again. Would you like me to investigate another lesser-known paranormal incident from the 20th century, perhaps focusing on the survival situations in the Canadian wilderness?